Europe is an example. That's according to the EU's Green Deal chief, Frans Timmermans. But Europe cannot do it alone. On that note, let's check in now with the two women leading international efforts on climate and nature. Patricia Espinosa, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Elizabeth Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, also known as the CBD. Thank you both for joining us. First question to Executive Secretary Mrema. Why is 2030 such a crucial date for reaching net nature positivity?
What is at stake is the loss of biodiversity reaching unprecedented rates in the history of humankind. Climate change and biodiversity are two global, inseparable environmental crises or challenges which we are all facing. We cannot deal with climate change without biodiversity loss, neither we cannot deal with biodiversity loss without climate change.
Now, politically, climate and nature are still separate, with less attention on nature. Why? And do you think the adoption of the new framework incoming could help?
The climate change COP Glasgow last year clearly showed the connection between climate change and biodiversity loss. Never in the history of the conferences of the parties of the climate change has nature biodiversity being discussed at a high magnitude, as was the case in Glasgow. And this then has built momentum for the post-2020 framework. And actually, we are looking at this framework as a Paris Agreement for biodiversity and nature, and a specific target on climate change that the framework will support the implementation of the Paris Agreement is there already in the draft. So we need to see a better integration of nature and climate change in decision making on an equal footing at national level. National plans need to build upon the premise that nature and climate change require a combined and urgent action. And ideally, they should all be across instances of government and not only separate. That is one. We also need to see governments to really take be ambitious and bold targets with clear timelines on redirecting subsidies, because the subsidies, particularly if we look at fossil fuel, when we talk of energy, we need this to be redirected into nature positive outcomes, away from nature negative.
And just finally, losing nature threatens our existence, as we've been hearing, as well as 50% of global GDP. And we've seen how the world failed the Aichi biodiversity targets. So I want to ask you, what are the crucial challenges for a successful new post-2020 global biodiversity framework and to get us to a full nature recovery by 2050?
Indeed, sadly, the previous decade we have failed to reach the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. However, of course, progress had been made in some areas, but limited progress. Lessons have been learned, and it is the result of the lessons learned because of that failure that these have actually informed the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Over 170 countries already have national biodiversity strategies and action plans in place. What we are saying, those can already be used to continue implementation and therefore contribute to the implementation of the framework. More important, which we failed in the Aichi targets, was the effective engagement of all stakeholders. Financial sector was hardly involved. Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth were hardly involved. There was an expectation that implementation of the Aichi targets was the responsibility of governments. We all know very clear, environmental issues cannot be dealt by one sector at national level, because each one of us, including individuals, have to play a role and contribute to that. So Immense consultations have been undertaken in the last 2 years plus, and thanks to the unfortunate situation of the pandemic, that it has given us this extra time, and the co-chairs in particular, to conduct those consultations with the wide range of stakeholders. And that's why these stakeholders can already see themselves in the framework. So we hope all this will help us to avoid the mistakes of the last decade and move into a really ambitious, transformative pathway to 2030, when we'll check progress.
As you say, there's no time to waste.
No time to waste. Scientists have told us we either take action now or perish. And the perishing is you and me, all of us. Because if the economy fails, there are no jobs, there's no food, there's no air we breathe, clean air we breathe, the water we drink, then there's no life. And if there's no life, then we've perished. What will we leave to our children and our grandchildren? A clean planet or a degraded planet? And the responsibility is us, the parents, the leaders of today.
And Executive Secretary Espinosa, as we edge closer to the next COP27, tell me, what must global leaders learn from the UNFCCC process for climate to ensure that the world acts with the most urgency on biodiversity and, of course, on nature?
I would not presume to give lessons, but let me just share some ideas that could help build momentum to protect biodiversity and nature. First, listen to the science. Supporting the intergovernmental and national work on the most robust scientific evidence is a powerful tool to advance collective goals. Second, listen to all, and then work to build consensus. Maintaining an open, transparent, and constant engagement with all parties and non-party stakeholders, ensuring that every voice is heard and every position respected. Third, be ambitious. The threats to biodiversity and nature are the result of entrenched attitudes and practices. The world needs strong, decisive leadership that sets goals commensurate to the risks we are facing. All climate goals are about nature. The activities of the UNFCCC, CBD, and CCD have a single purpose: protecting nature. Climate action should be seen as a driving force that builds momentum for the entire environmental agenda. Emissions reductions and adaptation efforts seek ultimately to prevent runaway climate change and its potentially devastating consequences for ecosystems and the species that live in them, including us.
Now, politically, climate and nature are still separate, with less attention on nature. How can we change this? And will the adoption of a new framework in Kunming help, do you think?
The UN sister conventions devoted to the protection of the environment can work together to promote greater coherence and collaboration to achieve shared goals. The private sector must also align its operations to those principles and goals. Clear goals and measurable indicators, such as those provided by the post-2020 framework, will help us follow up on the delivery of this crucial agenda.
And what other policy tools do we need, do you think, to ensure the success of the post-2020 framework?
Strong buy-in from the private sector and civil society will also be essential. Aligning national revenue and expenditure processes to environmental goals and aligning the financial system with the environmental agenda are all critical priorities.
Now, the world is still in the process of implementing the Paris Agreement. How far do you think transparency and accountability can get us to the 1.5?
They are key to fostering trust. This trust-based exercise is the best way to make progress in a multilateral process such as this one. Under the Paris Agreement, nations are fully accountable to each other, not the UNFCCC. The same would be true of CBD and other multilateral processes.
Now, companies, investors and local government are of course key, as we've been hearing, for the ambition loop on climate and biodiversity agendas in countries. So I want to know, what is your view on the role for non-party stakeholders for the next decade in both UNFCCC and UNCBD?
The responsibility to act is clear not only for governments, but for all. The term non-party stakeholders is a fancy way of alluding to all of us in our capacity as citizens, or more widely, as members of the human race. Every person in government and in business throughout the world must make decisions that respect the planetary boundaries. Our choices as consumers and voters matter.
And what are the critical next steps, do you think, to ensure climate and nature are treated as one in national environmental plans and targets?
Governments must apply an environmental lens in which the climate, the protection of biodiversity, and the fight against desertification, as the case may be, are central in the decision-making process. It is time to break down barriers in governments. The environment is a cross-cutting issue whose goals and policies span every department and jurisdiction, and also demands cross-border collaboration.
Thank you so much to you both. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Elizabeth M. Rema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity.